Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Cara. So before we talk about what to do about it, I'm just going to describe to you who we have here, which is no better panel. So on my far right, physically, is Alex McGilvery, who is the former Chief Counsel of Twitter. I like the General Counsel of Twitter when it was good, and former Deputy CTO at the White House. On my immediate right is author and entrepreneur John Battelle, who's CEO of many, many companies, including Recount Media, which is very confusing because Cara's Recode Media. And then on my immediate left is my colleague Jameel, Jaffer, who is the director of the Knight First Amendment Institute here at Columbia. So, first question to the panel. Cara says, what are we going to do about it? Jameel has a slightly different question for me, which is, what are we really talking about here? So, Cara, you're sort of pretty confident that we have this set of problems that need to be solved, but do we agree that this weaponization has actually taken place? Alex?
Well, I think it's both. The question on the panel topic is not just weaponization, because I think it is helpful to try to break that down, but also for what end, right? And the way the panel framed it was for speech, but I think a lot of these platforms, it's not really about speech, right? Facebook, to me, always was more like a dinner party than speech. And a lot of these places are sort of moving towards ends that are not necessarily speech. And so I guess maybe this is jumping a little bit to the conclusions, but I think understanding de-weaponization as not a single monolithic thing is pretty important. Because once you break it down, you're also talking about things that might be opposed to each other. So you look at like online harassment. To me, one of the things I want out of these platforms is to hear from people that I wouldn't otherwise hear from, right? I want marginalized communities to be able to reach lots of people. I want the Overton windows or the Halen spheres, I want them to be bigger, right? I want us to have a more vibrant debate. I think that's really good for progress. But we also have there are plenty of groups that we marginalized for very good reason.
Right.
And so the question around online harassment is we do want to protect voices that would otherwise go away from these platforms from the incredible violent online and offline harassment that they see. But at the same time, we do want to give people like white supremacists a way of understanding that they are not welcome there. And part of that is stuff that looks a lot like that same online harassment. And that's just one, I would say, that's just one facet of of the way I would think about breaking up de-weaponization. Goes into disinformation, doxing, the whole works, and the filter bubbles, and it's all, the solution to one may actually harm the other. Right. The only other thing I would say to bump us off is, I certainly believe that there is no one solution here. So I'm thinking a lot about how do we move off of the engagement metric as the metric that drives everything, and move towards maybe a number of metrics that are all based on improving this dialogue, but maybe in conflict with each other. Like we may be moving forward on one thing while moving backwards on the other. The last thing I would say is I've worked in this space directly on content moderation online for almost 20 years, and in places where if I could have solved it, I would. I didn't. So you should take everything I say with a big grain of salt.
Yes, so please ignore everything I say. Well, actually, just a very quick follow-up on that, which is, so when you were, at Twitter in the olden days, these questions must have come up. I mean, because there must have been a discussion that said, "What about the Nazis?"
Oh yeah, I mean I could go further back, right? My first run-in with this was there used to be this company that put Post-its on other people's websites.
Right.
And so it was called Third Voice. There have been many of these companies. It's like a perpetually good idea to an engineer that actually doesn't work. But people were putting Post-its on whitehouse.gov back in Bill Clinton's presidency, say all sorts of nasty things. And the question is like, what do you do about that? This is not, I mean, I don't think this is a new problem or a problem that hasn't had people thinking about it. What is useful, and I think this is to Kara's point, is that there are a lot more people thinking about it. They don't all look like me anymore, which is great. And there were some people who didn't look like me even back in the day. We don't want to erase those folks, but there are a lot more now. And that's really good and healthy. And we're getting a lot more outside of the companies as well. There's academic disciplines, there's a professionalization of the content moderation space. Right. These are all good things. We haven't cracked it yet.
They're necessary, but it's not yet sufficient.
Yeah, certainly not by a long shot. Like I think everyone, every thinking, living, breathing being believes that we haven't achieved what we want to achieve here.
John, what would you do?
I tend to look at almost everything that happens across these platforms at the core of the underlying business model. And when you said engagement, the reason engagement is the model is because of the advertising business model. And when you look at trying to fix Twitter or fix Facebook, Jack Dorsey just 2 weeks ago in an interview at a conference said, well, thinking back on it, if I had to do it all over again, I probably wouldn't have likes or follower counts, these simple metrics of engagement driving my company. Looking back on it, I probably wouldn't have done that. To which I'm like, you're CEO. This is a company that you could, from this stage, declare that you're getting rid of follower counts. You can, from this stage, you can attenuate whether or not likes or drive your algorithm. You can make that decision as you utter those words if I had it over to do again. The reason that he will never do that is because those are the metrics driving his business model. And these are all now public companies with shareholders, and we have to actually look at the role of a sort of unbridled steroidal capitalism in driving these problems. Because a lot of the speech that's been propelled and created the problems that we're discussing are propelled by the very algorithms that were driven to drive advertising engagement and profits in these companies. So when I think about fixing Facebook, the only way I see it happening is that we have to foster an environment where competitive companies actually can gain traction with new kinds of models, where innovators like in the days of yore when Alex and I were working on these on companies in social media in 2005, 6, 7, we all had an equal shot of figuring out a new model. But the model that ended up winning was a model based on 3 or 4 basic inputs of engagement that drove division and polarized discourse and enragement by engagement. And the direct connection between the business model and the outcome and the externalities is so clear, but so under-discussed, I think, in the debate, except for what has become, as Kara pointed out, sort of the hot topic today, which is antitrust.
Right.
But I think there are far more subtle and far greater potential innovative approaches to regulatory frameworks beyond just breaking companies up.
Absolutely.
Right.
I think what John was just saying, it's working exactly as it was built.
Right.
That's, everyone, what's really fascinating in Silicon Valley is they tend to be like, I can't believe this. But they literally built an engine to suck in information and to spit it back at you in a marketing plan. And so the thing I always say, like when you talk about, say, the Russians using Facebook or however, we'll never figure out what happened, by the way, because it's so massive and then it's unclear where the impact was. I always say this, and again, I repeat this again, the Russians were customers of Facebook. They were customers of YouTube.
They paid in rubles.
The neo-Nazis are customers of Facebook. They're customers of Twitter. They're customers of all these things. And they use them exactly how they're built. And so when they get up there and they go, we're so shocked it was used this way, and they tend to, one of the people at YouTube was saying to me, well, you can't blame us because we're like the car at a robbery, right? That's what they use. We're the car at a robbery. Can you blame the car? And I said, you're the gun. You're the gun at a robbery. Yeah, I can. Like, what are you going to do about the gun?
Yeah, I think actually we should ban analogies in Silicon
No,
Valley.
but that
Wait, except for journalists, we're allowed.
We're allowed. We can say anything we
the
like.
gun is a
Have
good
it
one
on,
because
yeah.
gun control.
Yeah.
Like, you know what I mean?
Which
Like-
also we're not keen on. I've noticed.
No, but that's-
I've noticed in your country we're not
Yes,
keen on
we're
that.
not, but-
So, on gun control. But so Zephyr Teach Out was tweeting this morning about this panel. Could we just have a ban on targeted advertising?
Yeah.
Which is actually a great question.
No.
So why not?
It just won't happen. It's like having a ban on a lot of things. It's just they can be controlled in a way. Like so Chris was talking about the breakup of Facebook, which
Yeah.
is just he was being dramatic. He's being dramatic. That's one of the ideas. It's not going to happen. That's not going to happen quite that way. But there's all kinds of different things you could do, from fines to certain guardrails that you put into place around privacy, a national privacy bill. There could be all kinds of legislation which monitors it a lot more, or puts more rules in place that they have to follow. And you could even go so far, and I think you all can talk about this more, of this Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. The fact of the matter is, no matter what we do, these companies have full immunity to do whatever they want.
Well, that's actually on mentioning CDA 230. It's a good point to bring Jameel on. Because obviously, kind of when you curtail or moderate the business model of these platforms, you moderate speech, or even go into regulation. So, again, in Chris Hughes's, I didn't really want to spend this morning discussing Chris Hughes's article, but he says, and by the way, we should also be moderating or regulating speech, which is a highly kind of unusual thing to hear anyone espouse.
Yeah, and I think that particular proposal really is a non-starter. If the government were to enact some statute that limited what people could say on social media beyond the limits of the First Amendment already sort of recognizes, then the courts would strike that down. But I don't think that everything that Facebook or the other social media companies do is properly thought of as speech protected by the First Amendment. Most of what they do is the same kind of stuff that every other business does. And if there were a statute that regulated what information Facebook could collect about its users, or how that information could be used, or that required Facebook to disclose more information about its algorithmic decision making, or regulation that essentially broke up Facebook, not by separating WhatsApp or Instagram from the main platform from Facebook itself, but by separating, say, the social network in some way from everything else, from the interface. It's not obvious to me that would implicate the First Amendment. So I think there's a lot that can be done without running up against the First Amendment. There's a debate to be had about whether those ideas are good ones.
Right.
But I don't think anyone, should not dive into this debate because of the fear that the First Amendment will get in the way. I don't think we want the First Amendment to be an obstacle to healthy free speech.
Yeah. Well, that's useful to hear, because obviously we do hear a lot about, don't change anything because of the free speech issues, which is sort of, Jack Dorsey's been down that particular rabbit hole.
It's also so, Jameel gave a sort of law professor answer to why you don't want an acceptable use commission in the federal government, an acceptable speech commission in the federal government. You don't want an acceptable speech commission in the federal government because it's bad for the First Amendment, but also because it's a really bad idea, right? The examples that we have, and Ron Wyden said this on your show, my jaw dropped, that we should have some sort of decency principle that should apply to speech, to every single bit of speech online. And the examples of that, they're just not good. They basically, the majority persecutes the minority, and minority speech doesn't happen.
Yeah,
right?
Effectively we'd be trading the power that Mark Zuckerberg has over the speech environment for Donald Trump having power over the speech environment.
Donald
and that's
Trump
not a great
has been
trade.
elected. I mean, so this is a confusion that we Europeans have sometimes, which is that everyone in America talks a lot about democracy, but doesn't want the government to control anything, where actually you do elect these people. So there is an interesting question here, which and in Europe it is litigated that people would rather have the government control that than they would private companies. So it's not a frivolous question.
It's also like we aren't allergic to even controls on speech. We have lots of places where that does happen. What I'm saying is that the idea that we as a community can agree on what an acceptable amount of speech to appear online, not in Facebook or Twitter or any of these particular services, and do it in a way that isn't extremely detrimental to the other rights that we hold dear in this country, not even talking about speech, but talking about progress and liberty. That's just, to me anyway, the data out there is that is a nightmare. And so it's worth noting that we have people proposing these ideas. That's how bad the situation is, right?
Well, that is the other thing, which is we talk about the slippery slope. So I constantly have people from Google say, we don't want to go down that route, we'd be at the bottom of the slippery slope. And it's
Well,
like,
that's because that's the only phrase they know.
But we're at the bottom. We are.
They
They
get on their slippery slope fainting couches.
Are we actually at the bottom of the slippery slope right now? So, when we say it's a sign of how bad things could get, and we're talking about, because again, sort of proportionality of response. I see in Singapore this week, there were speech laws saying, things are really bad, we are going to make sure that we can...
well, they were actively worried about more attacks that were caused by online disinformation.
Well, this is Singapore, not Sri Lanka.
Yes.
But again, Sri Lanka switches off the internet. Says
Emily, isn't it?
Didn't switch off
your
the internet,
focus,
switched off certain parts of the internet, just to be clear.
You're focused on what speech is on the platform, and to me that seems less important than what the companies are doing with the speeches on the platform. Right? There's always this kind of focus on these spectacular acts of censorship. Alex Jones is kicked off the platform, right? And then there's a debate about, does Alex Jones have a place in the public square or not? And I don't mean to suggest that debate isn't, significant, worth having, but it is, I worry, a distraction from the much more important question of why Alex Jones is so popular on Facebook. It's not because Alex Jones is persuasive. It's because Facebook privileges speech like that over other speech, right? And so you want to have, I think that debate should really be more focused on the algorithmic decision-making that, has already been referenced a few times on this panel, but the decisions that end up amplifying the worst speech and suppressing speech that we actually need.
Well, someone who worked for AMAC talked about this, Nicole Wong, on a podcast that I did, and I think she really framed it really well. It's how you do the architecture of creating these things. Initially, look at Google search. It works pretty well. It's pretty clean. When you search for, this is something I did, ADL on Google, you get the right results. You get the website, you get news stories about ADL. It's a relatively clean environment that you get exactly what you're supposed to get. When you go over to YouTube, when you did go over, they fixed this since, when you went over to YouTube to do the same search, which is owned by Google, you got 20 anti-Semitic videos instantly. That's the first searches. And so what Nicole was talking about was the architecture. And so if you architect for accuracy, community, and context, you get pretty good results. You get the right, if you architect these algorithms in that way. Right. When you architect for speed, virality, and engagement, you get Alex Jones. Of course you do. And then, and then it's 3 clicks to Hitler. It's really, it's fascinating.
So back to the point that John made about these are the metrics and the currency. So this is the currency that actually kind of makes them enormously wealthy and successful. So when we're talking about de-weaponizing, we're sort of talking about decommercialization too. So
I don't think we're talking about decommercialization at all. I think we're talking about the fact that we have stopped innovating in this space. I think that we're in a desert as it relates to innovation in social media. There isn't a venture capitalist really up until about a year after Cambridge Analytica that would even consider funding a company that was going to go up against, $500 billion market cap companies that are sitting on hundreds of billions of dollars of cash. No one wants to fund a company whose business model is, I'm going to beat Facebook, right? And that's actually starting to change right now. People are realizing there's vulnerabilities, there's opportunities. But the truth is, for reasons actually that Tim Wu and others have pointed out, we had a consolidation in innovation in social media, search, and e-commerce that kind of said, "Oh, we figured all of this out. This is a solved problem." Until all of a sudden we realized it wasn't a solved problem. So I really believe we need to create environments that allow for the innovation that I think is possible. We are nuanced human beings in person. We read a lot of data off of each other when we see each other and meet each other and look each other in the eye. And we're very good at making determinations about what we should say to each other face to face. We're terrible at it online. And the tools that we have been given so far have not helped. They've not given us the ability to be as nuanced as we're capable of. It strikes me as odd that the Valley isn't building tools that are more nuanced, that give us...
Odd, really? Have you met these people? I don't mean to be, like, it's not
It just, for
John, the reason-
all of us as optimists in the 90s when this, when we all this kicked off, I really thought we'd be a lot further than we are now.
No, but crap in, crap out. And the problem is, the other thing I keep saying is the reason these systems are the way they are is because these people never felt unsafe a day in their lives.
That's true.
So they never understand lack of safety. They never understand marginalization. They never understand the inability to speak up. And you can look at the like right now. I think most venture capital, 80% of venture capital now goes to 3 states, 50% of which is California, 60% of which is the Bay Area. That's an astonishing situation. And then when you look at their diversity numbers, they don't move. They don't move anywhere, and all kinds of excuses for not. And so we're getting exactly what we built.
Which is why I think that if you start to think in terms of regulatory frameworks, you have to get outside of privacy and speech. You have to get into economic policy.
Right.
You have to get into how do we change the incentive structure that drives a new approach to innovation in our economy.
So that, to some extent, is where the policy discussion is going at the moment. You have Elizabeth Warren making...
Well, it's pretty blunt, like break them up. That sounds like a Trump tweet.
Okay, so let's get to the sort of chorus, like, what are we going to do about it? So what are we going to do about it? What is a good... Alex, what's a good regulatory framework that would... where would you start?
So one thing I think Daphne Keller, for all of you, is a great person to follow on this particular topic. She just had a great thread that was around sort of models within communication law, communication plus antitrust on speech, and thinking about what that would look like as applied to Facebook and the like. I think valuing data and networks within acquisition valuations would be extremely important in terms of how we think about that in antitrust. But I also think, I don't want to I'm going to return to what Kara said, which is the strongest, we don't just want a whole bunch of competitors that are the same folks, right? We actually need to diversify the pool of people that are doing this work and make it so that they can also succeed. I've tried very hard to learn this stuff. I don't think it can be learned. That feeling of fear or the default of not being able to speak up, that's something you can observe. It's very hard to actually learn that. So I think something that doesn't, at a societal level, maybe it's shaming, maybe it's laws like the making sure that women are on boards, for example. But pushing that forward as a foundational thing that will help with these problems, I think is
boards are a perfect situation. They make all kinds of excuses about diversity within the ranks, STEM, blah, 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 blah. They have all these things. What happens, what's really fascinating is they tell you how smart they are all day long, and then when you come with them with an actual problem, they're like, this is very difficult for all of us. And why don't we do it? Have you ever noticed whenever Mark has a problem, he moves into the we? Like, together we need to solve this problem. I said, well, if you give me one of your $64 billion, maybe perhaps I shall. But if they don't want to do that, they want to keep the money, they want to keep the power, but do not, and want to share the problem.
But this is even I think we are moving, I'm starting to notice that we are moving forward on this on panels. Like we don't have as many panels that are all white men as we used to.
Yeah.
Yay. But board memberships,
boards exactly.
less so. So I don't know.
Incidentally, when Cara and I represent diversity,
we're not diverse.
We're still in a bad place.
Yeah, exactly.
I agree,
I'm sure that obviously I'm on board with diversifying Silicon Valley. It'd be great. That's a great idea, and I think we should do it for many different reasons. But I'm not persuaded that just swapping out the people, even with people, people more like us or more like people, who know marginalization from their own experience, I'm not sure that would address the set of problems we've talked about today. It seems structural to me.
It is structural, but it's not even, doesn't even happen. The diverse views don't even get to happen. Years ago, I think you were still at Twitter when I did this, boards are a perfect example to start to, first of all, giving boards power. Now, in Facebook's case, they don't have any. Mark Zuckerberg is king of Facebook. He just is. The board is at best an advisory group, at most someone to have dinner with every quarter.
His governance board is Peter Thiel, Mark
No, but they don't have any power. It doesn't matter.
No, but I'm just saying it's a very weird kind of governance.
It could be a German Shepherd, a cat, and a sparrow. It doesn't matter.
Right.
It doesn't matter he has no power. It's like ridiculous to even pretend to have these meetings. There's no oversight. There's zero oversight. But let me just finish this board idea. So years ago, when we were talking about boards, one of the things that happens is when you go to these people and say boards are places where there's plenty of different people you could bring pressure on these companies, or to at least have a discussion where they pause for a minute. And so the board of Twitter was 10 white men of almost the same age, of the same group. It was like fascinating. And I was trying to get at the idea of this. Like, do you understand what's happened here? And what they did is like, it just sort of happened. It's mathematically impossible for it to have happened the way it did. And so I was trying to get to the idea. And so I literally wrote the best single lead I've written in my entire life, and I should have retired immediately after. But it was like the board of Twitter, which has 3 Peters and a Dick, which was the case, right?
Fact, yes.
I know. And so Dick Costlow, who's the CEO of Twitter, called me up. He goes, "I think that's unfair, though. Very funny." But the fact of the matter is that's somewhere where you begin to start to shape it. You begin to take power away from Mark Zuckerberg, so he cannot make one person makes every single decision for the most important communication platform in history.
But so I'm hearing about sort of like board reform. John, you touched on actually more innovation, and these seem to be free market type of. What about the non-free market? Because the free market really has screwed this up, to a large extent. Why would we now trust the free market to get it right?
Oh, I think you should do all of them.
And so you mean you would have external regulations?
I think you should threaten removing 230. You should see what happens when you say that. I was at YouTube and I said, what about they don't just blanch. They're like, whoa, oh my God, the lawyers are going to kill us. Yes, they are. Like, you could start to really play with that. There's all kinds of things you can do.
Jameel, you're talking about structural changes.
Well, since I don't think there's just one problem, I don't think there's just one solution, but among the solutions I would consider are privacy regulation that would limit what they can collect and how they can use it. We talked a little bit about transparency already. When we use that word transparency, we often think that the problem is that Facebook isn't releasing information that it should be releasing. That is part of the problem, but part of the problem is that Facebook doesn't have the information we need, doesn't know what it's doing, doesn't know what its platform is doing. And the journalists who want to study Facebook often run up against Facebook's own terms of service, which restrict them from using digital tools to study Facebook. Yeah. So another, I think, very important reform would involve, in some way, limiting the terms of service of these companies. Opening up their data and opening up the platforms for study by journalists and researchers.
That was hit after Cambridge Analytica, though, that they pulled it back to.
They use that as a shield. I'm actually doing research on this at Columbia.
These 2 classes of investigations, Cambridge Analytica style and ProPublica. There's a way to do that.
Yeah. Sorry, John, you were going to say.
Well,
doing research.
We're at SIPA. We're actually doing research on I call the shadow internet constitution. We literally, all of us, have apparently met in a room like this and agreed to a constitution that governs how our information flows through society. We just actually didn't show up and we didn't get to vote. But those terms of service, the data policies, Amazon has 26 different policies that you've said yes to, assuming you're an Amazon member. And these govern how our information is used, and we completely don't understand them. They're hundreds of thousands of words. They're written by folks like Alex here.
Not those ones.
Not those ones, right? But they are extremely good at protecting any number of angels dancing on the head of any number of pins, including machine-readable data portability, which I think actually could solve a fair number of problems if it was possible to take out the valuable information that companies had on you and give it to someone else, and not have to work for an hour to make that possible, which is essentially where we are today, but rather with a push of a button make that possible. I know a lot of entrepreneurs who would start companies to use that data in lots of ways, and that's just not happening right now. And if it could happen, if it was easy, by the way, GDPR has been in place for almost 2 years, and they have data portability built in, but nobody's doing anything with it because it's really hard. You can't have that much friction. You need machine readability, and you need the ability for user agency so you can create an agent who does this on your behalf. And will there be negatives to it? Yes. But I think overall we're pro-internet, and there were a lot of negatives when the internet started as well. But we've got to push the intelligence to the nodes, which is each of us. And we have to push agency to each of us around our data. And I think that that's a place we could look at in a regulatory framework as well.
It also would give us so much more information to do effective and intelligent privacy regulation to understand more. So I'm all for that. The other thing I would carve off in terms of de-weaponization is we are talking sometimes about foreign state actors.
Yeah.
And we have a whole, there are law schools, departments on how do you influence a foreign state actor that is doing something you don't like. We should use those tools. The Obama administration did use those tools. The Trump administration should be using those tools to make it so that we don't have to worry about foreign state actors doing things that we don't like in our country. And we should hopefully abide by those same views when we conduct ourselves against other countries.
Same thing on classes of stock. These ability for these single entrepreneurs to control companies. Google is still controlled by those two crazy people. Like, I'm sorry, they are. They do. Like, so I do not. It's like astonishing that we allow it. And what they do is they use the excuse is we're trying to protect these companies from Wall Street investors or short-term thinking. We need to protect from them. Like that, you know what I mean? Like that they're either incapable. You've got Sergey off on his 10-wheeled bicycle and Larry doing hovercrafts, and it's just like, why are these people?
Yeah, I mean, you could also do both things, right? You could
Right.
say, okay, you're worried about the corporate raider and the day traders. We'll fix that problem, right? Like
exactly.
that's not a bad problem for society to fix anyway.
The inability to fire, the inability to be fired is really an amazing thing. Is it amazing? And when I did do that thing with Mark, I was like, who got fired after any of these things at Facebook? Nobody. Right. Nobody got fired because he doesn't want anyone to be fired. And we had a very interesting exchange where I said, who got fired? Who got fired for this? There were like 20 things down the list. And he ultimately said, well, I guess ultimately it's my responsibility since I'm the CEO. And I said, okay. And he said, you want me to fire myself? I said, that works for me. And it was like, just like whatever. It's just there's no accountability anywhere in the system because of the way the power structure is built, which the VCs like, which Mark likes, which the Google guys like, and it's still continuing with these recent IPOs. Not at Uber, which has a board of 15, 17, 36 people, I don't know. But but other companies where, like I think Pinterest, I think Airbnb, I think has that. I'm not sure which ones have it, but
so there's still founder problem is real,
yes.
isn't it? Yeah.
Yes.
Right, I'm going to go to the audience for questions if you raise your hands. There should be a microphone, I'm told. Yes, microphone is over there. Can we have it? We've got 2 questions down here. So while the microphone is making its way, wending its way down the room, how confident are we that there will be any change in the current political environment? And by current political environment, I mean 2020 and beyond.
Are we asking whether or not Trump's going to be reelected? That's too early in the morning to talk about that. First of all, if you look at all 24 of the Democratic candidates, there's 22 plus 2 that are probably going to announce this or next week. All of them in their top 4 talking points talk about the issue of the Internet Bill of Rights or data protection or privacy or
election.
It is in or election interference. It's in the air right now. So it's very heartening that this is part of our national dialogue. Right. It's disheartening how it got to the point of being in our national dialogue, but it's good that it is. Mm-hmm. But politics is politics, and no one wants to make a nuanced point, right?
It's also not just this country. I know we're Americans, but what's going on in New Zealand and Australia is critically important. What's going on in Europe, New Zealand and Australia will be super interesting. And then there's 10 states now working on privacy bills, which is a problem because let's just say we don't want the Louisiana ones versus the Arkansas ones versus the California ones.
Right.
De-weaponize social media for speech. That sounds very confusing to me. Let's go back to the basics. Speech is not a problem. Somebody can be at their house and talk whatever they want. It's communication that's the problem. how much people are exposed to it, how much people acknowledge it. Because let's face it, the internet is a tool, and a tool that can be used as a toy. And in fact, it's not the World Wide Web, it's the World Wide West, okay?
Right.
So you have a situation where too much control is utopia, and lack of control is also utopia. So we got to find a balance. Now, the issue of Facebook. One of the appeal of Facebook is because there are a lot of people there. So I'm getting to my question. So for us to have a company that compete with Facebook, they would have to offer access to all these people. The more people Facebook recruit, the more powerful it becomes. So should we go to should we nationalize or make it a non-profit organization, or should we just let it be a private entity? So the question is, do we want private control, or do we want government or non-profit control? Because there's always going to be control. It's the World Wide West.
Yeah. So that's a long way into a great question, which we sort of danced around and answered. Public or private control?
It's not going to be public control. It doesn't matter. I mean, it's the idea is is this the actual public square? And should we admit it that it's a public square? And there's a lot of actually Supreme Court law on this. There's one called Prunedale Shopping Center versus
Pruneyard. Yeah.
Pruneyard. And then there's another one related to Jehovah's Witnesses in a company town. There's a company town that Jehovah's Witnesses wanted to go into. It's a really
Marshfield, Alabama.
Thank you, lawyer. This is my lawyer speaking. There's these cases, they're crazy. And they're all about the idea of making private places public and the idea of it. And so there's interesting questions of it, but it's also never going to happen. It's just, that's the issue, is taking the idea of taking it. Look at Facebook's response to the Chris Hughes thing. Read that very carefully, how they said it. We don't want to take an American company and make it, it's an American company with jobs. Every buzzword was in there.
And then they sent out their talkers, the whisper campaign around that was China.
China.
We don't want Tencent to come in here and take over. And that is the most insane.
It is. It's Mark does this argument, I call it the Xi or me argument, which is, if you don't let me do what I want, Xi's going to come in here and do it. Literally, it's like fascinating. Yeah. And so he did this Xi or me kind of thing, and I was like, I don't like either of you. Let's option trois. Let's go to number three.
Yeah.
And so it's a question, but I think they can be regulated properly. You don't have to make them public utilities to make them regulated.
Right. Okay. So nobody likes utility regulation. Next question.
We have time for one more question, so I'll pass it here.
Oh, now there's pressure.
Joe
Plotkin with the Internet Society. You talked about it briefly in terms of making individuals, giving them more of a sense of agency, and it seems like that's missing from this conversation. It seems that the public, as a public, we have vomited up all our details to Facebook. We have given it to them. Mm-hmm. Wouldn't there be a good use of a public education campaign about your data trails, to starve the beast, to not vomit your personal details to Facebook? It's tougher with an Amazon, which is a purchase, but to hold back and to choke off the supply line, the oxygen that they live off of.
Yes, I once heard Eric Schmidt saying we should all just be more careful about what we put online, which is absolutely absurd.
Executives of these companies have been more careful. They've deleted their own histories, interestingly, and they also don't let their kids have screen time. They do. Some, but they say they don't, which is very much in vogue. But I mean, for one, I actually think, as having two teenage daughters, one used to be a teenager, now is not, and she actually went through this learning herself. We put warning labels on cigarettes, and if you ever go to the UK or Australia, those warning labels are terrifying.
We all still smoke.
Yeah, but I know we all still smoke. But the point is, you smoke with a clear understanding.
In Italy, they just have skeletons in shop windows, and people smoke all the time.
Yeah, right. But you understand what you're in for. I think that the public education issue is such that people really don't understand what they're in for when they engage with these platforms. And I think, an educated public would be certainly a step forward.
But there are addictive qualities to these. There are so many people working for them that they want you to push that red button, and you will push that red. You don't understand who they employ to make you do the things they do, which they hide. These have addictive qualities, and so they could be regulated.
Yeah, I also think that I'm all for the public education, but I think it goes only so far, because we want to be able to use these tools, right? You want to be able to type something into a search engine without having to worry that same search is going to come back at you 10 years later when you're running for office or something like that. And that is not something that we can fix through public education. We need regulation to limit what the companies can do, what they can collect, and what they can do with the information. And Europe seems to have managed it, or at least a version of it. It's not obvious to me why we can't manage that here.
So do I have time for one? Do we have time for
Yeah,
one
we have
question?
one more question. We have one right here.
Excellent. Okay.
Actually, I got you. Yeah, it's you.
I totally agree with how the root cause of a lot of these issues are the business model, the ad business model, how that's promoting engagement, and so on. I'm just curious, what happens when you strip that away? You get rid of the ads, you get rid of the algorithms, you get rid of the engagement model. You have things like WhatsApp or more closed systems, and there's still misinformation campaigns, there's still horrible stuff being passed around. What's the solution to that?
There's certainly less
So
viral.
I was going to say, that is a great question,
Yeah,
because
there's
it is
certainly
now.
less viral. Look, Facebook stopped having the virality of WhatsApp. They limited it to 20 people. They used to let you have hundreds of people. That was a really good move, but why didn't they do it in the first place? You know why? Because they wanted people to use it. And so there's what Mark is doing right now is pivoting to privacy. Did you see this new thing that he's doing? That is a problem, is it all goes underground, and it starts to really be problematic for the encryption and other things to do it. And so, everywhere you go, you do face an issue. But again, it doesn't mean you can't regulate some of this stuff.
So Alex, that's a kind of a problem, if you like, that when you were founding Twitter, or in the early days of Twitter, it was all about this idea that it was essentially still a broadcast model, and now we're going into this sort of weird world of closed groups that actually have thousands of members in them, but they're very difficult to parse or investigate. You can't get into them if you're a journalist, you can't get into them if you're researchers. We're trying to do this actually with the Indian elections at the moment, and it's another step. So
Yeah, I think that there's also a question of splintering of networks, and do you want all the white nationalists and the white nationalist curious people on their own little network just talking to each other, or do you want them out in the world so that we can yell at them? But I don't. I think I would say you have different levels of different problems in different network constructions, and it's not just public-private. It's going to be the whole range, and we don't have as many models for how to deal with some of the more private stuff, because in part we don't have a way to get academics in there, we don't have a way to get journalists in there, we don't have a way to have that be in the light. It's much more just the engineers at particular companies.
Alex, you said something right at the beginning of the panel, which I think was exactly right, which is that some of the problems we're talking about stem from the centralization of power in Facebook or in a small number of Silicon Valley giants. And some of the problems we're talking about stem from decentralization, right? And it's, for obvious reasons, difficult to solve the centralization problem without making decentralization problems worse, and vice versa. And so ultimately, I think some of these questions involve trade-offs. We're just going to have to accept one set of problems, not because we like that set of problems, but because it's better than the other set of problems.
I think you'd agree. This is an issue of power and money and centralization of power, and that is always usually the problematic thing to innovation, which was John was talking about. There hasn't been a new social network since 2011. What does that say?
You don't count Parleo?
Yo.
hello.
There have been many social networks. They just haven't
They
been
can't
broadly
make it.
available,
Exactly.
public things. And I think that's the thing that we often undersell. We haven't as a society, come up with a way for 1 billion people to have a conversation all together and have it be like great. That is not something that is solved.
Well, that's also not something necessary.
Or indeed,
I don't think it's necessary. I think we have other ways of organizing ourselves, but I think we should, at the very least, acknowledge that maybe the mission that Facebook has, and to a limited extent Google, to connect everybody in one big community is ludicrous. It's a ludicrous
I like that.
mission.
yes,
I'm with that.
ludicrous.
Yeah.
So everything from external regulation to changing mission statements to boards, etc. The great news is we have lots of fodder for more panels for many years to come. That was a great conversation. I could listen to it all day. I'm sure you could, but we can't. So thank you very much indeed, guys. That was
Thank
great.
you.
Thank you, everyone.